What's up, YouTube? You already know it's your boy Sticks, and we're going back in the mix. So today, the reaction video, we're going to go inside the Supermax where they're currently housing El Chapo and look at the living conditions and the type of isolation that goes on behind these prison walls. Let's get into this. Come on.
It's here at the Administrative Maximum U.S. Penitentiary, where he will be made to spend his life sentence plus 30 years. Today we take a look at how insane El Chapo's prison cell security is. El Chapo's escaped Mexican prison twice, in 2001 and 2014. However, his stay this time around seems to be much more permanent. This Supermax prison is nicknamed the Alcatraz of the Rockies and has never had a prisoner escape since its founding in 1994. El Chapo, 62, arrived at the facility on July 19, 2 days after his life sentence. He joined other high-profile offenders like the Unabomber, an Oklahoma City explosives conspirator, and the 1993 World Trade Center criminal. Why is D X so renowned? Just 2 hours outside of Denver, in the parched Rocky Mountain foothills, sits the highest security prison in America. Its official name is the U.S. Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility, but everyone calls it the ADX. The ADX in Florence, Colorado is the one and only federal Supermax prison, home to the most dangerous and escape-prone inmates in federal lockup. Among nearly 400 male inmates at ADX are several infamous characters. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman was sent to ADX after escaping twice from maximum security prisons in Mexico. So was Eric Rudolph, the Atlanta Olympics explosive culprit, the 9/11 conspirator Zacarias Moussaoui, the Oklahoma City explosives criminal Terry Nichols, the 1993 World Trade Center criminal Ramzi Youssef, and Michael Swango, a doctor who poisoned and took the lives of up to 60 of his patients. Prisoners don't end up in...
So this Supermax prison, as you can see, it houses some of the worst criminals that's ever been around. Ever. Some of the most violent and craziest crimes that we've ever seen.
The ADX by accident. Many have committed grave crimes, either on the outside or in other prisons, including take the lives of guards. Others are hardcore gang members who have ordered or carried out prison hits, and a significant portion of the men housed at ADX, as many as a third by one estimate, have a diagnosed mental illness that makes them a serious threat to themselves and others. But critics of the ADX and other Supermax prisons argue that regardless of these men's crimes or mental illnesses, the conditions inside their hyper-secure facilities, in which prisoners spend 23 hours a day in solitary confinement, are the very definition of cruel and unusual punishment. According to the United Nations, they even qualify as torture. Life inside ADX Florence. At other prisons, inmates are placed in solitary confinement for short stints in response to violent or aggressive behavior. Corrections officials call this type of punitive solitary confinement administrative segregation, better known as the hole. At ADX, also known as the Alcatraz of the Rockies, the entire prison is essentially the hole. ADX inmates are confined by their 7 by 12 foot cells 23 hours a day. They receive all their meals through a slot in the cell door, and their only glimpse of the outside world is through a thin slit of a window aimed at an empty sky. This deprives prisoners of learning the layout of the prison and the location of their cells. No one has ever escaped from ADX Florence. Since ADX inmates can't be trusted with anything that could be broken down and made into a weapon, all the cell furniture is solid concrete and immovable. A concrete writing desk, concrete chair, and a concrete slab, topped with a thin foam pad that serves as a bed. The bathroom is a combination toilet, sink, and a shower that turns on automatically 3 times a week. With good behavior, inmates earn the right to buy a small black and white TV with a built-in radio, and to borrow books and magazines from the prison library. Phone calls are limited to 15 minutes a month to close family members. Prisoners are allowed 5 visits each month under strict circumstances.
Now that would be crazy, only allow 15 minutes a month to talk to your family members. But at the same time, most of these inmates are doing life anyways. So what does it really matter? But they said their cell window looks to the sky so that they can't remember the layout, so it makes it that much harder for anybody to escape that prison, which they said nobody has. But trust me, if there's a way, El Chapo, he'll find it.
The only time that inmates are allowed out of their cells is for an hour of exercise. Handcuffed and shackled at their feet, inmates are either led to an empty room with a single pull-up bar or taken outside to the yard, where they are locked alone inside a caged pen. Robert Hood, a former warden at the ADX, told media that the ADX was not designed for humanity. When it's 23 hours a day in a room with a slit of a window where you can't even see the Rocky Mountains, let's be candid here, it's not designed for rehabilitation, period, end of story. In another interview with the Boston Globe, Hood described the eerie quiet of walking through a modern prison facility where all the inmates are locked down. The ADX is a far more stark environment than any other prison I've ever seen, and I've been to all of the federal prisons, said Hood. I call it a clean version of hell. Why Supermax prisons exist? There are roughly 2 million people in prison or jail in the U.S. at any given time. According to the U.S. Bureau of Prisons, a small segment of that population poses significant challenges to wardens, guards, and other corrections workers. The difficulty of controlling those individuals, described as the most dangerous, recalcitrant, aggressive, and antagonistic inmates in a prison system, drove the design and construction of increasingly secure facilities. The first super maximum security prisons were built in the 1980s, and there are now more than 30 so-called Supermax prisons in the U.S. ADX, the only Supermax for federal prisoners, was built in 1994. Karamet Reiter teaches criminology and law at the University of California, Irvine, and wrote a book about a Supermax prison in California called 23-7, Pelican Bay Prison and the Rise of Long-Term Solitary Confinement. The explicit rationale for Supermax prisons.
Now let me ask you guys something. Do you think these Supermax prisons are cruel and unusual punishment? Because I'm well aware that there's certain people that shouldn't be in society, right? But there's also other people that shouldn't even be housed around regular criminals. You're talking the worst of the worst. So, does that fall under the cruel and unusual punishment? Let me know. Put it in the comments. I like to see what you guys think.
Is that there are people who are so dangerous, they have to be removed from the general prison population, and by removing them, everybody else would be better off, says Reiter. Theoretically, there would be less violence, and you could deter gang behavior by locking people away in these really harsh and restrictive conditions. But Reiter says that there's little evidence to support the rationale that near total solitary confinement is an effective way to address prison violence. On the flip side, there's mounting evidence that long-term solitary confinement is akin to psychological torture and increases the risk of certain types of violence, particularly self-harm. What solitary confinement does to the body and mind. Reiter says that doctors have known since the 1960s and 70s that solitary confinement and sensory deprivation have immediate and lasting effects on the brains and bodies of prisoners, as evidenced by the experiences of American POWs in Vietnam. We know that locking someone up in solitary confinement can cause all kinds of psychological problems within days, if not hours, says Reiter. With Supermax prisons, we've essentially been running a mass experiment on the effects of long-term solitary confinement for the last 2 decades. For ADX prisoners, they're only regular contact with them.
So basically, they're using these inmates as an experiment to see what solitary confinement does to somebody's mind when they're locked up for so long by themselves in these cells. That alone is kind of crazy to me.
Other human beings are the brief interactions with guards who bring them meals and escort them to the yard. A 2014 report by Amnesty International found that ADX prisoners routinely go days with only a few words spoken to them. The effects of long-term solitary confinement range from depression and anxiety to full-on hallucinations and psychotic breaks. We've heard the disturbing story of an ADX inmate named Jack Powers, jailed for robbery and sent to ADX after escaping from another prison. The isolation sent Powers spiraling into insanity. He cut off his earlobes, chewed through a finger, and smashed his head open in order to inject his brain with bacteria-laden fluid. ADX has 6 different levels of security, and inmates can move from...
Hold on. Did you just hear that? He cut off his own earlobes, chewed through a finger, and did something else so he can inject his brain with bacteria? Did I hear that right? That was just crazy. You're telling me solitary confinement had him do that? And where did he find these tools to cut off his earlobes? There just wasn't enough said right there. It leaves too many questions, for sure.
Restrictive to less restrictive housing and possibly to other prisons. But even when released from solitary, the effects of isolation linger. In 1993, a doctor named Stuart Gracian described a condition called SHU syndrome. Solitary confinement facilities are also called security housing units that characterized by paranoia, panic attacks, aggression, and psychotic symptoms.
It means you're in your cell for 23 to 24 hours a day, by yourself. Shout at anyone. You just have to be alone with your thoughts and toss and turn till the morning. Subject to a full strip search, humiliating cavity searches every time you left your cell. Those were the darkest years of my life, and during that period, I would have done absolutely anything to get the hell out of that place.
Are Supermax prisons unconstitutional? The Eighth Amendment of the Constitution prohibits cruel and unusual punishment, and given the known psychological effects of solitary confinement, shouldn't prisons like ADX be outlawed? Legally, the conditions inside Supermax prisons are constitutional, says Ryder. They have been challenged extensively, and no court has held that keeping someone in solitary confinement for any specific period with any specific degree of deprivation is unconstitutional. There have been some small victories for prisoner rights at ADX. In 2016, the Bureau of Prisons settled a class action lawsuit with 100 mentally ill ADX inmates who were denied antipsychotic medications and left to languish in awful conditions. The settlement led to the transfer of some of the most disturbed inmates to...
Alright guys, that's pretty much it. So put in the comments, let me know what do you think about these Supermax prisons where they basically just admitted to using inmates as a study. Which to me is kind of crazy, because even if you did do some of these crimes, some of the unthinkable, you still are a human, so you should still be able to get some rights, unless you're a child molester or somebody that forces herself on somebody else. To me, I could care less what happens to them. But check this out, I want to say something real quick. So for everybody that's been supporting my channel, you're always hitting that like button. You're always jumping in the comments. You always got something good to say. Just know I appreciate that. Now, if I was to shout everybody out and make a list, I'm sure there'd be somebody that I would miss and then I'd feel bad for or whatever. So I'm not going to do it on an individual level. But just know, I see you guys. The same people in my comments, the same people that's hitting that like button. You interact with me, you interact with my channel. It's only a matter of time before I kick this YouTube door open and go up. So, just keep riding with me, and I'll keep putting out the content. Hey, until next time, I'm gone. Keep your head up. Stay out of lockup.